don't really think about them in terms of like when they were introduced into the Union. Obviously we have the 13 original colonies from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, etc. over here. And then we think about Alaska and Hawaii being the second to last and the last ones introduced. And then maybe we think like, oh, well, there used to be big Virginia, but then it's Virginia and now West Virginia. Or we think like, oh, well, what about Puerto Rico or DC? That should be a state, maybe, or not, depending on your personal political beliefs there. But there's this idea we don't really think about some of this middle stuff. Maybe you think like, oh, we got Texas from Mexico, but like beside that, we don't really think about this. And so I kind of think there's this idea that some people might have that they just kind of directly progressed westward, where as we took over more Western land, we just got more and more of these Western states. And that's not really true. When we did take over the land, things didn't necessarily become states in a very uniform sort of way. Like if you look at U.S. states by the date of admission to the Union, we see the 13 original colonies up front. Then we go Vermont, we got Kentucky next, which makes sense. Tennessee, Ohio, these are making sense. Louisiana, Indiana, we're kind of going down there. Arkansas, Michigan, Florida, Texas, Iowa, Wisconsin, all this stuff's making sense. This is all kind of eastern U.S., Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, all this stuff. Then all of a sudden, California. So we jump from Wisconsin right here to California way over there. Wait, that's weird, right? We've been doing all east stuff. Now we're over here in California. And at this point, the U.S. has a lot of this territory. We just went from here to here. California is pre-Civil War. Like over here, 1850, this is pre-Civil War. Then we go all the way back to Minnesota. Then we go all the way to Oregon. And we're just jumping around all over the place, right? This Firefox overload. We're just jumping all over the place. Then we go back to Kansas. Then we create West Virginia as a separate state. And now a lot of this stuff, especially some of these earlier ones around this era, is a result of like slavery and different things like Nebraska, the Nebraska-Kansas Act, that sort of thing, the creation of West Virginia. A lot of this is like out of slavery stuff. I do think it's interesting to look at some of these western states because they were introduced later than you might expect. And I think one of the most interesting cases of this is Utah, number 45, the Utah Territory, which created before Oklahoma. Here was a state before here was a state, which is bizarre to think about. But Utah has a super interesting and unique history on its own right, because it really should have been a state a lot earlier than it was. But it wasn't. So Utah started off as the Utah Territory. And we had it in 1850. And wasn't a state until 1896. That's a huge chunk of time. As far as I'm aware, this is one of the largest chunks of time a territory like this has existed. Like other territories, we kind of get them and then we kind of split them into states. Utah, though, that was a territory for a very, very long time. Utah, if anything, should have been up here in the middle areas, like in the 30s, but it's not. It's all the way down at 45. And, well, why is this? Well, there's a few reasons. But they all kind of converge into the same thing. Now, if you know anything about Utah, you know about this thing right here called Mormons, if I can ever spell correctly. That's not it at all, but Mormons. So basically, they were a religious group. You probably know about the Mormons. They're a religious group that was founded around the 1830s, I think 1830 exactly, in the area of Utah, and are incredibly popular in Utah even to this day. More than half of Utah's population are Mormons. Now, I'm not here to talk about necessarily the good or the bad about Mormons, but this is really important to understand why Utah was introduced to the nation so late. Let's look at this Utah Territory right here. It existed for a long time. Why wasn't this a state? Well, as it turns out, the U.S. government was never really all that big of a fan of Mormonism. Now, obviously, there's separation of church and state, and legally they're not meant to discriminate against faith, but that's not exactly how the government works. You see, the way it actually works is there's a separation of church and state, and they're not allowed to they're not allowed to punish people for acting on their religious beliefs unless those beliefs are contradicted by a pre-existing law. For example, you cannot sacrifice people's lives for the sake of a god because killing people is illegal. So even though you're acting on your faith, the other laws take precedent. And in Utah, that same sort of thing was the case with Mormons. Now, if you know anything about Mormons, you would probably know about this thing called polygamy. Now, polygamy, if you don't know, which I would be surprised if you didn't know, is basically like having a bunch of wives. And, well, that was a core part of Mormonism, was having a bunch of wives. See, actually, here come a lot of the controversy surrounding Utah becoming a state was because of all the Mormons basically ruling the state that it would have been, and because those Mormons were in favor of polygamy. The U.S. government did not like polygamy because of polygamy by settlers. See, which itself would become the plight of a cause from the fight from the United States to the Great Salt Lake Basin after being forcibly removed from settlements of the further east. U.S. government didn't like polygamy very much. And maybe you like it, maybe you don't, I'm not really sure. But basically, this kept Utah, the whole territory of Utah, from becoming a state for a very, very long time. And what's really interesting to look at it is how the Mormons wanted the state to look. Because the state, in the way that it is, if you look at Utah here, this looking Utah is not the Utah they wanted it to be. They didn't want it to look like this. They wanted it to look like this. Now, this is something called Deseret, which maybe you've heard of. And basically, this is what the Mormons in Utah pitched as being what their state looked like, which is absolutely insane. This state right here is absolutely gigantic in compared to basically every state besides maybe Alaska. I think this would have been the biggest state in the nation. And they really, really wanted it to be a state. It didn't really end up happening. Here's the Deseret flag, because the U.S. government just kind of was not really into. Yeah, see, it was a provisional state. It was proposed in 1849, and it was proposed by the Mormons, or in this case, the Latter-day Saints, which is just another word for Mormon. But obviously, didn't really end up turning out. So we have them getting the Utah Territory in the 1850. We have the state of Deseret, 1849 to 1850, kind of pitching this area. Didn't go right, went to the Utah Territory. As time goes on, this territory gets gobbled up by other states. Then eventually, the U.S. turns it into a state, all the way down here in 1896. Why did they turn it into a state then? Well, it's for the same reason they didn't turn it into a state before. Polygamy. U.S. government didn't really like polygamy very much. And if you look up the history of Mormonism, you'll find that eventually they banned polygamy. Mormons banned polygamy. And if you actually look up when this happened, over here, they banned polygamy 1890. Utah became a state 1896, right? Just a few years after they banned polygamy. And that was not a coincidence. The U.S. government, polygamy, illegal, didn't like it. But Utah Territory did like it. So U.S. government didn't like Utah Territory. So U.S. government didn't make Utah Territory a state, even though they could have back way in 1850. We could have been in an era where Utah as a state existed during the American Civil War, which is insane to think about. Obviously it didn't go that way, but it could have. So we go. State of Deseret. They pitch it. Doesn't work. Utah Territory gets founded. They want it to be a state. U.S. government says no because of polygamy, because of the Latter-day Saints in Utah. Latter-day Saints, Mormons, they banned polygamy 1890. All of a sudden, U.S. government is like, let's relook at Utah as a state. And they go all the way down. And on January 4th, 1896, Utah Territory, boom, state, the state of Utah, right here. So yeah, that's basically the history of the state of Utah. Or at least like a very heavily abridged version of like the history as to how Utah ended up becoming a state. And I think it's really interesting to kind of look at as a state because of how much we kind of look at the separation of church and state. And Utah is really the only state where there really isn't much of a separation of church and state, where the Mormon faith is very, very politically powerful in this area. And seeing how the U.S. government at large kind of looked at the Mormonism and at some of their beliefs and were like, well, no, you're not really part of our country yet. Until you get rid of this one part of your belief system we don't like, we will not administer you as a state, right? Now, if this was any other major religion this happened to, I feel like people would probably get pretty mad. I'm not a Mormon, by the way, so I'm not like fighting on defense of them or anything. But if it was like, if the U.S. government didn't want like a state to become a state because it had a lot of Catholics who, I don't know, who like dipped their hands in holy water before they prayed, that would be like a massive deal. Or, but since it was to the Mormons, it was kind of like not as big of a deal, which I think kind of speaks to how the U.S. in general thinks about Mormons. A lot of people kind of treat them as a joke, which like maybe is fair. Mormon jokes are generally pretty funny, but a lot of the time, yeah, see 18. You even see, look on their old flag, you have when the territory was like founded back in 1847, and then way like 50 years later when it actually became a state. And the reason it became a state, they got rid of polygamy. The reason it wasn't a state earlier, because they had polygamy. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting case study on how the U.S. government in general views Mormonism and how the U.S. population in general views Mormonism. Because this seems like it would be a pretty big deal that the government basically made a religion change its practices so that the territory it was in would be acknowledged, right? Which seems like a huge deal, even though it generally isn't treated as such. But yeah, I don't know. I just think this is interesting. What do you guys think? Was this video a waste of time? Maybe, almost certainly. If you liked it, tell me about it in the comments below. If you hated it, tell me about it in the comments below. But yeah, thank you guys for watching and have a great day.